Morning, folks. Hope you're doing well. It is check the date here. It is November 8th, about 10 o'clock here in countryside Illinois. And it's been a while since I've ranted about general things of interest, at least to me. So I thought I would take advantage of this relatively quiet morning. I'll just sort of catch up with you, see how you're doing, hope you're all doing well, etc., etc. But I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about some reading that I've been doing lately. And let me just turn a light on or two. I'll be right back. That should help a little bit. Okay, there we go. Yeah, it's a little bit better. All right. One of my theory professors at Acadia would occasionally, during lessons and other times when we were chatting together, would show me books and talk excitedly about, say, you should really read this. This is something that's really interesting. So try this, try that, etc. Look at this. Have you read this, etc., etc. That kind, and I was always grateful to him for doing that. And I thought maybe I'd do a little bit of that this morning with you guys, and just some general thoughts on things. As you guys know, I'm something of an amateur historian or a armchair historian, and have read a lot. I like to read about history and historiography, etc., etc. And one of the things that I have found recently has been of great help to me to understanding not just sort of general knowledge, but it's also just a way of understanding how certain patterns of thought, basic ideas and patterns of thought have effect and motivate different people around the globe, and I thought I'd like to share with you a little bit of what I've learned recently, and I may have bored you with this particular one already, but I've recently finished a reading from back to front. Actually, I started in the back and ended up in the front of the Quran, and reading the Quran has been very, very, very helpful to me. Even though it's I was only able to read it in English translation. And as people may know, and I may have bored you already with that, to really read the Quran, which, by the way, is translated as the recital, is to read it. To really read it, you have to read it in Arabic, because the sound of the language, the sound of Arabic, has a lot to do with the meaning of the words, the meaning of the text. It's the sound of the language that's very, very important, which I think is very interesting because that's very different from the Christian church, which has produced all kinds of translations of the Bible and parts of the Bible into various various languages. So I think that's rather interesting that translation is encouraged or is frequently used in the Christian church, whereas for the Muslims to really study, that book, you really have to learn to read and speak a bit of Arabic at least. So I think that's really rather interesting. Also, kind of let's see what. Oh, yeah, and the other thing that I've came across in the Quran, at least, is that the Quran does. There are numerous references, not only to different Old Testament figures such as Moses and Abraham, but also to Jesus of Nazareth. There are a lot of different mentionings of him as the Messiah of the Israelites. So they neither number one, they neither deny his existence, nor do they deny nor do they deny his importance as the Messiah of the Israelites. And so I think that also was very, very interesting for me anyway. Anyway, and again, I'm just sort of picking out one or two things that I found to be particularly interesting and worth thinking about. And we're thinking and allowing reading that book to at least influence a little bit, how I view and how I consider how I consider myself how I relate to the world, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that was really rather interesting. The other things that I've recently picked up and read from cover to cover are translations of some Buddhist texts, particularly the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Dhammapada. This is an edition by Eknath, or translated for the modern reader by a man named Eknath, or I'm assuming it's male. I don't know if it is, or Eknath Iswaran, and I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. But I found these also to be very, 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 very interesting for a number of reasons. Not the least of which is that particularly in the Bhagavad Gita, which is actually, make sure I'm getting this right. The Bhagavad Gita, let's see. The Bhagavad Gita is sort of takes place on the day of a major battle between armies, and one of the things that one of the points that it makes in the Bhagavad Gita is that, in a way, battle is unavoidable in life. So and what I take that to mean is that difficulties are inevitable in life, and you have to face them. And there's just no way you can avoid this battle idea. And it's how you face and how you deal with adversity is very important. What battles you choose to fight, and how you fight those battles, I think is really rather fascinating. And the Upanishads are also rather interesting. These are some of the they're very, 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 very old, very, very, very old scriptural writings from India. And one of the things that I found to be very interesting is something that that is talked about a lot in the Upanishads, is this idea of separation of mankind, of humans from God. So that the struggle and again, I'm oversimplifying this, and I'm sorry about that. But my read is that it's part of life. The challenge of life is the attempt to reunite with God, and that can take more than one lifetime. But it's the inevitable, or the constant search to reconnect, or to become part of the Godhead, that I think is really rather fascinating, because I see that as, or at least in my limited, ignorant way of seeing how that kind of resonates with the idea that Christians want to conduct their lives in such a way that they eventually will reunite with God and with Jesus. So I think that this is really rather fascinating, that both of these religions deal with the idea of reuniting or reconnecting with God. And no matter whatever you call God, it's the attempt to reconnect, to retie, which, by the way, that's what religion means. I think religion is a Greek. I think it's a Greek word that it comes from, ligature. I think I don't remember offhand, but what it means is a kind of retying between pieces of a rope or a chain, that have been separated from one another. And I find that quite fascinating, that similarity. And again, I'm oversimplifying, obviously, but that kind of commonality of the attempt to reconnect with your God, or with God, I think is really rather fascinating. So I found that in reading, this particular translation of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Dhammapada, this English translation of the Quran, and so far I've only managed to work my way through the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which is one of the things that first got me into reading religions and taking this kind of comparative religious approach to at least my thinking about and considering various things that I found interesting. And I also want to read the King James version of the Bible as well, because it too is an interesting version of the Bible, and there of course are lots of other different versions of the Bible that have been around. Not the least of which, as I understand it, the main competing form of the Bible back when the King James was written was something called the Geneva Bible. And apparently there are some significant differences between those two. And that's something I look forward to getting into at some point in the hopefully reasonably near future. And again, to just sort of consider how that these systems of thought and belief have motivated, for both good and bad, a lot of what's gone on in the world and is still going on in the world. And just having this as context for me has been very, very, very helpful. And I would recommend anybody who's interested, I would recommend this kind of reading to anybody else who's interested in trying to figure out his and or her place in the world, and how the world relates to him, he or she, and how he or she relates to the world. I think it's really important to do that. One other thing I wanted to tell you a little bit about is I've also just recently finished a book by Peter Gibson, which is called A Short History of Philosophy, from ancient Greece to the postmodern era, and that, which I actually picked up from here, commercial time, folks, from Half Price Books. As a matter of fact, I got a bunch of these other things from Half Price Books as well. And this has also been very, 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 very enlightening. I'd never actually undertaken either as in a class or independently, sort of just to try to get a sense of the unfolding of how philosophy has evolved over time. And this is really, really rather fascinating and has made me particularly interested. And again, this is sort of what I find to be particularly interesting. Are the Stoics of Marcus Aurelius and that crowd, and the existentialists, particularly Camus and Kierkegaard, that I have found, what I've heard, what I've read in this has made me want to seek out more reading on that topic, of those topics, what these guys actually said. And I think it's really rather fascinating, particularly this concept of the myth of Sisyphus, and how that relates to the artistic process, because the artistic process is very similar to what Sisyphus in Greek mythology eventually ended up doing. He was cursed his fate was to attempt to roll a large boulder up a hill to the top. But every time he does, it rolls back down and he has to restart the whole process all over again. And particularly Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus says that's not necessarily a curse. And it's very similar to what artists do. Artists start the same basic process of starting working towards completing an artistic creation, in my point, like a piece of music, right? And then once that's done, you have to begin the process all over again. And that process is not necessarily a curse. It's not necessarily a curse. It's that process that you go through again and again and again to succeed in creating new works of art, etc., etc. So it's not necessarily a curse to have to go through the same basic process over and over again to end up with different results. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that perhaps the more people gave that some thought, like how can we take, a process and to have it work not only once, but more than once, to the benefit of ourselves as an artist, as a composer, but also to the world. We keep producing these things, and hopefully these things produce a positive impact on the world, right? And couldn't we perhaps borrow that basic idea of reuse of basic materials, of effective basic materials, to perhaps adapt that and apply that in other fields of endeavor? Anyway, I thought that was rather interesting, particularly, and of course I haven't gotten very far in my reading of Marcus Aurelius yet, but the Stoics have also sort of captured my interest as someone who's trying to broaden his context, trying to broaden his perspective, and get more of a more complete a more complete understanding of how a lot of people in the world have thought, and how think and what motivates their actions. Because a lot of people really believe a lot of this stuff, and they act on it, right? And it's for both positive and negative results. So I think that the more you can do this, the more general reading of particularly religion and of philosophy, a general sort of scope, context for philosophy, does not hurt you when trying to understand, well, what the hell is going on? Right? Why is this happening? So I think that's very interesting. Also, the other thing that on the topic of history and of philosophy and of other things like that, I recently came across an old version. Actually, this is also from another one of my former professors. This time from where I was working at Lewis University up until a few years ago. This is The Philosophies of Music History by Warren Dwight Allen, which I have read I think I read a couple summers ago, and I found very interesting. And I wanted to share with you a few things that I found really rather fascinating. And am I going to be able? One of the things that they talk about at some length is that this concept of American music and what we mean by American music. And hopefully I can find the quote. But of course, I lose the quote where I had it. But it talks about the fact that well, what do we mean when we say American music, right? And how much of that discussion has left out a good many areas of the North American and South American continents in the discussion of what is currently often referred to as American music. Not the least of which being Canada. Canada has every bit as much of a reason or a good for a justification to consider itself and to be numbered in the general picture of American music, because guess what? Canada exists on the North American continent, and therefore is in that sense American, every bit as much as anything else on the North or South that can be considered a kind of American music. And I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody either side of the border. It's true. It's true that this can be considered this. It has every bit as much a right to be considered the part of the American musical scene or the music of the Americas as anything in the United States or elsewhere. So, for example, R. Murray Schafer is every bit as much, in that sense, an American composer as, say, perhaps like Milton Babbitt. They too, they're every bit as American as, they are both from the Americas. And therefore, and I think that it would be a good idea to keep that in mind. Similarly, we also, when we think of American music, we practically, if not literally, ever, it's very rare that we actually talk about, say, like music from Central America, Central America or South America. For example, there is not only a lot of very interesting Mexican and South American, Central American folk music and popular music, but there is also a large number of composers, of classical music composers from South and Central America that are practically never discussed, never known about. As a matter of fact, the only Mexican composer I really know anything about, I myself personally, is Roberto Gerard. And the only reason I even know that guy's name is the fact that one of my composition professors from the University of Illinois mentioned to me, I said, one of these days you should check out check out some of Roberto Gerard's scores. I think you'd find him very interesting, my composition professor said. So, and that's something that I've tried to do and keep trying to do. And this is especially true when I've had a number of very, 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 very good South American, Central American, and Mexican students recently. Very, very, very bright, very, very talented, very, very intelligent, hardworking students. And they, every bit as much as anybody else, whether you were born in Spillville, Iowa, or New Mexico City, Mexico, or Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, we can all be considered in a very real sense. We are all American musicians because we inhabit the North American and South American continents. So a broader perspective, as broad a perspective of American music and what American music means and what it implies, I think is worth thinking about and worth considering and worth our time and our industry to consider. We should be able to consider, like I mentioned, Roberto Gerard, but we should also know something a little bit about Harry Summers, right? We should know Milton Babbitt every bit as well as we should know John Weinswag, the dean of 12-tone composition in Canada. So it's this. What I'm trying to suggest is that to broaden our minds through reading and through listening, and just to keep reading, I think is very, very important, particularly these days. It's a good idea to have a good sort of a basic understanding, or at least a basic feel for Buddhism and a basic feel for Islam, every bit as much as for Christianity, right? To be as at least some sense of how those things relate to one another. That's not a bad idea. That's not a bad thing. Similarly, to get a sense of the broad scope of philosophy, how people have thought through over the ages. This also has been very very, 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 very enlightening. And a general philosophy of my own field, music history and theory and composition, has been very, very, very helpful. So keep on reading. It doesn't matter what you read, just keep reading. That's something else another one of my undergraduate professors kept saying to me. So keep reading. Doesn't matter so much what you read, it's just to keep reading. so that you keep this gray matter going, something going on in here. And you'll find life, I think, to be a lot more enjoyable, and you get a lot more out of it. Anyway, that's sort of a lengthy rant, but it's a rant that I've kind of wanted to be doing recently. The next time you see me, it will be more on history of theory and composition and etc. aspects of late 19th, early 20th century Russian music. I'm about to finish up my series of lectures and discussions on selected pieces by Sergei Prokofiev and how the golden mean and how the Fibonacci series and the Neapolitan degree are important basic pieces of material that you can reuse, that can be reused in different ways to create different pieces, but using those things in the process each time. Okay, anyway, I guess I've talked your ear off long enough for now. It's about 26 minutes since I started, and so now I shall close. All right, I hope you're all doing well. Take care of each other. Take rest, read, think, and I will talk with you soon. Bye-bye.